Hello and welcome to a new video. Today I'm going to be talking about Scorn, and more specifically the delay they've made in order to make both parts 1 and 2 as a single game, as opposed to releasing part 1 and then working on part 2. Now, it's no secret that Scorn has had a rough development time at this point. In fact, the questions people ask aren't what mechanics are going to be in it, will you be able to do this or that, will it be on consoles, what's release date, but instead what people are asking most is, when is this game going to update? After all, it's been 6 months since the game last updated. The reason for this update is because the developers were able to strike up a deal with a funding company called Kowloon Knights, who, according to the developers, takes a very hands-off approach in terms of creativity, but will give them enough money to realize a game as they've always wanted it, and to be able to work on a complete game as opposed to two halves of a game. So in this video I'm going to be listing the pros and cons of delaying the game like this, and try to think of things both from a developer perspective as well from the perspective of the customers and potential player base. Starting with the good, I think the biggest advantage is the fact that the developers have enough financial independence in order to make this game, and do so as they want it. No doubt many lead developers, part of the larger studios and companies such as Bethesda or Ubisoft or Activision, had an idea for a game that never got truly realized due to the higher-ups demanding this or that change based on what they think people will want in their video games, and also based on how much they can nickel and dime their consumer base. So to be able to make your game, and one that is as out there and strange as Scorn is, at least in comparison to most games that were announced at the time, is certainly a benefit for the developers and perhaps even the player base if the game actually ends up being good. Another advantage is that both parts are going to look pretty much the same in terms of graphical quality because they're both being worked on at the same time. The developers have even confirmed that they've gone back and change some of the assets in order to match the sort of graphical fidelity they're able to achieve with modern day hardware. Another thing they're able to do is make sure that what would have been the end of part 1 and the beginning of part 2 is able to function seamlessly rather than having to set up what I assume, based on the fact the game won't have any cutscenes, a hard end for part 1 that just kicks you back to the menu. Another advantage, this time for the player base, specifically those who back the game on Kickstarter, is that all the rewards are going to be effectively doubled. So let's say you pledge to get the art book that contains the concept art for part 1. You'll also get the concept art for part 2 attached to that. If you got the soundtrack for part 1, you'll get the soundtrack for part 2, and so on. Whereas if they released only part 1, there's no guarantee that they might have did another Kickstarter that would also get you access to this stuff for part 2. I mean, maybe Kowloon Knights would have funded them in December 2018 and they decide, alright, we don't need to do a Kickstarter for this one. So in general, the game being delayed will allow it to be more finished, more refined, and perhaps even better, at least as far as the developers are concerned when it comes to their vision. And though the old wisdom that a delayed game is eventually good but a rushed one is forever bad does not necessarily apply in this day and age of online patches or downloadable fixes, and that a delayed game can end up being a travesty, it is overall true that the shittiness of the video game industry is a result of developers having too little time as opposed to too much. Though I will point out that Scorn has been in development for about 5 years now, the majority of which was strictly relegated to just Part 1, so if they are working on Part 2, even with more people working with them, it's going to be quite a wait. And now onto the negatives. When I started this video, I highlighted the length of time between updates, not how long development has taken overall. And there's a good reason for that, because despite the very lengthy development time, the vast majority of people don't necessarily mind waiting for a decent game to come out. But what they do mind is the lack of communication. I've said in other videos that these developers are secretive to a fault, and I stand by that. Delaying the game by an additional massive chunk of development, coupled with their aversion to spoilers or what they consider to be spoilers, and posting updates, means that it's going to take even more time in order for them to talk to the community, give an idea of what they're working on, show what they've worked on, and so on. Because if they were adverse to showing anything from Part 1, one could easily imagine that anything from Part 2 is going to be a massive spoiler in their eyes. Indeed, that is the largest source of frustration for people, the lack of communication, the lack of updates. Is this game being made? Is it vaporware? Is it all massive scam? If they released Part 1 in October 2018, then people would actually have a game to play, they'd have something to speculate on, something to build hype for the next part, and something to talk about, as opposed to just waiting for a sparse update that may or may not come and is probably going to be delayed, even if they say, oh, it's gonna come in a week or a month. Another big advantage they'd have if they released Part 1 in October 2018 is they would have community feedback. If there's a gameplay mechanic that just really is not fun and is bogging Part 1 down, they'd be able to see what they're doing with Part 2 and notice, oh wait, this gameplay mechanic that's really unpopular is in it as well. We should probably remove it or try to change it to make it less frustrating, or something of that nature. They would also likely have higher sales for Part 2 if Part 1 was released, because there would be that initial half of the game that would build up hype. There'd be a bunch of YouTubers and Twitch streamers playing it and getting everyone invested. Meanwhile, as long as they're delaying the game by this much and the wait is this long, it's likely going to end up hurting the sales of the game, based on the fact that it's out of people's memories. Every time somebody recalls, oh yeah, that Scorn game, and checks it out, they see practically no communication at all. Some people even mistake the game as not getting an update, or the developers not updating for years at a time, which I guess is their own fault for not being inquisitive enough or doing any amount of research, but that is a fact of the matter. And while the developers don't necessarily strike me as the people who are concerned with money, at least not in terms of revenue from the game, they're in it for the art, I do gotta wonder what Humble Bundle thinks about their initial investment taking this long to come out. Like, are they okay with it? But at the end of the day, it all comes back to the updates. No matter how busy you are, no matter how much crunch you're going through, it really would not take a long time to write down what you did in the previous months and post a screenshot or concept art. You can even hire your concept artist to draw some pictures that are Scorn related, but nothing that would actually spoil the game. Like, just to throw out the most absurd scenario possible to illustrate this point, if at the end of the month you post an update, here's what we did X, Y, and Z, and then the accompanying pictures of Scorn guy dabbing, nobody's gonna be spoiled in the game itself by anything related to that concept art, because it would be pretty damn clear that you're not going to include dabbing in your video game. In this day and age, communication is key. It's no longer the case where hearing anything new about a video game has to only come from official publicized sources like Nintendo Power or Game Informer or any sort of game website or magazine. Developers are able to communicate directly with their player base, and this is especially true with Kickstarter developers because ultimately people have already invested money, oftentimes far more than they would have if they just bought the finished product, into your work. And while it is true that they can ask for a refund, and you do point that out quite often when the accusations of being a scam are thrown around, that's not the point. The point is, it would be really trivial to just at the end of the month say, here's what happened this month, here's a picture or a short clip or a screenshot that really shouldn't take any time at all out of development to get, and see you next month. The longer it takes for something to be developed, the less it seems like, oh, these are artists who are really dedicated to their craft, and more, these people are mismanaged and somebody needs to help them figure out what to do and how to organize themselves. And that's just when it comes to making the game itself. When it comes to just making an update, it borders on ludicrousy. So is delaying the game a good idea in order to combine both parts? I would argue overall yes, for the reason that whatever issues crop up in terms of gameplay mechanics that the community might not like could still potentially be fixed in a patch or an update. You can add a lot to a game and change a lot of stuff with those patches. And whatever hype might be lost could perhaps be regained by a announcement trailer or release date trailer later down the line. However, all this rests on if the developers themselves are transparent, if they are willing to let people know what they're working on, if they have, say, a definite release date down the line, which Scorn doesn't have, and if they just communicate. Like I said before, communication is key, and the more these developers stay silent for longer, I think the more it's gonna bite them in the ass. But that's all I have to really say about this. I hope you enjoyed the video, that I gave you something to think about and otherwise entertained you. Take care.